الخير وأهلا وسهلا بكم في حوار جديد مع المنصة. معانا النهاردة الدكتورة لوشيا سوربيرا، رئيس قسم الثقافة واللغة العربية في جامعة سيدني بأستراليا. يا ترى إيه السبب إن حصلت ثورة 2011؟ سؤال كبير ممكن نجاوب عليه بأكتر من طريقة، من منظور اقتصادي أو سياسي أو اجتماعي. الجديد في كتاب دكتورة لوشيا إنها بتحاول تجاوب على السؤال ده من منظور نسوي. في كتابها الصادر السنة دي عن كاليفورنيا يونيفرسيتي بريس، حاولت الدكتورة لوشيا خلال فترة إقامتها في مصر من 2011 ل 2023 إنها تجري أكتر من 60 حوار مع نشطات نسويات من فئات وطبقات وأعمار مختلفة، وعن طريق الحوارات دي قدرت إنها تبني تصور عن إزاي كانت الحركة النسوية وقود محرك للحراك الاجتماعي في مصر، مش مجرد عنصر ملتحق بيه. حوالين دور الحركة النسوية على مستوى أعمق بكتير من مجرد المطالبة بالحقوق والمساواة هيكون حوارنا النهاردة مع دكتورة لوشيا. أهلا يا دكتور.
شكرا جزيلا.
يعني كنا عايزين نبتدي الأول حوارنا بنقطة أساسية، وهي إن احنا نحاول نفهم أكتر إيه هي النسوية، باعتبار إنه كتاب حضرتك اسمه سيرة نسوية، وبالتالي هو بيقدم لنا تصور أو قراية مختلفة للتاريخ المعاصر من منظور نسوي. فايه هو المقصود بالنسوية وازاي بتقدم قراية مختلفة للتاريخ؟
شكرا جزيلا. هجاوب بالانجليزي
اكيد
لو سمحت. The feminism it's both a philosophy, a political philosophy, and a social movement, and it's a very peculiar and interesting one because it mixes the praxis and the theory in a very unique way. It has, of course, a global and long history. You know, we can trace its history back to to the aftermath of the French Revolution, and continuing, until today throughout multiple phases that certain scholars call waves of feminism. They call it waves because it goes ups and down. You know, there are moments where there are peaks and you can and it's more visible, and there are moments where it is repressed or confined and it's less visible or even less relevant to the public discourse. And in my book I argue that Egypt is a crucial hub of global feminism, and it's a space from where we can see extremely important and historically stratified developments of feminism.
بالظبط. انا حسيت ان حضرتك بتقدمي الثورة المصرية تحديدا في 2011 على انها نموذج ممكن الحركة النسوية في العالم تتعلم منه.
Aywa, yes, 2011 was a moment of extreme visibility of feminist activism and more broadly women's political activism, not only feminist, because women mobilize as feminists, but they also mobilize as non-feminists, and it was a moment of high global visibility, but as it has been underlined by some of my colleagues in Middle East and Egyptian feminist studies, many of them Egyptians, others international like me, and as I try to document in this book, what happened in 2011, it's the peak, the result of a long wave of invisible underground mobilization that we need to document and trace back. So the peculiarity of Egypt in global feminist historiography and movements is that Egypt is a country that has been studied by feminist historians, both Egyptian and internationals, and I've been, studying their work. It's a country where feminism is well documented. We have a lot of documents produced by women because women were writing as journalists since the late 19th century. They were writing as they were teachers, they were writing memoirs, they were active in the trade unions, in the labor movements, they were active in the arts and in the performing arts as writers, etc. They were business women, politicians. They have been literally everywhere, and their activism has been documented. What we lack, and what I try to do in this book, is to create an organic narrative, which is also long term. So I go back to the early experiences of women's feminist writings, and I trace it, and I trace these experiences until today, especially in relation to politics. So what do we learn about Egyptian politics and about Egyptian society if we read it through the lenses and experiences of women intellectuals and activists? So these are the two key. I look at Egyptian women mostly as intellectual and activists. So this is not a book about Egyptian women in general. It's a specific component that is in conversation with global feminism. And I argue that global feminism has a lot to learn from these specific experiences.
بس اسمحي لي اسال حضرتك، يعني قبل ما ندخل في التفاصيل المساله المصريه، كنت بسال على المستوى النظري ايه اللي ممكن تضيفه سرديه نساء عن التاريخ لفهم التاريخ، يعني ايه اللي ممكن نتعلمه من كتابات او تدوين النساء، وليه هو ممكن يبقى مختلف عن تدوين الرجال؟
Yes, it's a history that goes beyond the official representations of politics, of society, of law, of the philosophy of law, because the experience, women have not only a practical role in the society, but also a symbolic role. And they bear, the traditions of the families and the larger groups they belong to. They are expected to play a role of care for the community, be it the small community of the family, the extended family, the political party, or the larger movements they are part of. And by being active in political movements, they transform the political movements they belong to into movements that have to take care of. And this is what I name a politics of care. And this is what I think is the contribution of women's political activists, especially those who were part of the students' movements in the 70s, that then developed into underground Marxist movements towards the 80s, and then the human rights movement. I trace the genealogy of women who were part of these movements. And I argue that, the human rights movement benefited a lot from the inputs that came from the women who were part of it.
هل ممكن حضرتك تدينا أمثلة صريحة ومباشرة على مدى استفادة يعني حركة مطالبات حقوق الإنسان أو الحركات السياسية بمساهمات النساء في الحركات دي؟
أيوة, absolutely. They, women brought a very specific contribution to these movements. When they joined them, they were young university students, and they grew up in a context, post-colonial Egypt, where they were supposed to be part of the construction of the post-colonial state building project. They all tell me in their interviews, our families, our teachers, the schools, the state, they all were expecting us to graduate and to work. This was what was absolutely normal, and many of them study sciences, medicine, and law. All they are everywhere, literally everywhere. What was not expected from them, and they did it in a sort of unexpected way, was to claim that the personal was political, that having a balance of duty of care in the family would have reflected in a different level of education for their kids, and would have had an impact into the general politics. And clearly, these are changes that are slow, that take generations. But what happens is that then if you interview young people who were part of the 2011 revolution, and they come from these what I call feminist families, where, if someone is, I've interviewed people, whose couple were arrested for political activism, and they had their friends or siblings taking care of the kids altogether. And, or you have families that are separated because one has to do, for various reasons, the feminist friends become like aunties for the kids in the family. So you have this new generation that then are the protagonists of the 2011 revolution that experiences this world of politics of care and affects that, in my view, has shaped their way of thinking and imagining the 2011 revolution.
how يعني ازاي إعادة تشكيل التصور بقى في 2011؟
ازاي؟ يعني it was an holistic approach to politics. You know, the people who were involved, directly involved in 2011, had very clear in their mind that a political change could happen only if also core issues of socioeconomic justice were addressed, that if human rights were embodied in people, so not talking about human rights as an abstract category, but human rights in their everyday life. They had very clear in their mind that the change should happen if everyone was involved, besides political, ideological, but also gender barriers. So mutual respect, respect of the boundaries of each other's bodies as well, and hence all the discourse that developed about even sexual freedom, sexual harassment, and violence, both in the public and in the public space. Clearly, these are very complex discussions that don't happen in a society from one day to the other. They are built upon generations of activism. And I argue that women intellectuals, the writers, the teachers in the universities, sometimes they're not even famous, because they work very hard and so they don't have time to promote their work. But through their activities of mentoring, of translating, of creating archives of women, they had a huge impact in the education of a revolutionary generation.
طب يعني لو هناخد بقى التطور التاريخي اللي حضرتك بتتكلمي عليه، اظن حضرتك بتبتدي زي ما بتقولي من الحركه الطلابيه في السبعينات بالاساس، نقطه البدايه يعني، وبعدين مع السرديه اللي حضرتك بتقدميها في الكتاب بنشوف انه بيحصل زي نوع من الانقسام جوه ما يمكن ان نسميه يعني الحركه النسويه في مصر، ما بين الحركة النسوية اللي هي المستقلة اللي ممكن تبقى موجودة في التنظيمات السياسية المعارضة، في النشطاء العماليين مثلا وخلافه، والحركة النسوية اللي هي اندمجت مع الدولة أكتر وتبنت ممكن قيم محافظة شوية. ممكن حضرتك تشرح لنا الوجهين، وجه الدولة ووجه المعارضة في النسوية المصرية؟
Yes, we should decline the word feminism at the plural, feminisms, because there are multiple ideological streams and multiple attitudes towards how to position themselves towards the government in different times, but also towards international organizations, international fundings, etc. Broadly, it can be made a distinction between the so-called, institutional feminism, and independent feminism. But in reality, these distinctions are quite blurred, especially because, both organizations and women, in the context of their lives, they can also take different positionalities depending on the moment. There are moments where there is not an alternative but collaborating with
بالاعتماد على رؤيتهم السياسية للحظة بالأساس يعني depending on their political view.
Depending on their political view, absolutely, but also depending on the context and the objective, the specific objectives, At the time when the Egyptian government was supporting, for instance, the creation of a task force to eradicate or at least medicalize female genital cuttings, radical feminists who had been advocating for independent feminists all over their lives, they joined the forces with women that were working in the institutions because they had a specific objective to obtain, and And they did something very important in that moment. There are other moments where the gap is broader and they don't work together. So we always need to understand the differences. Yes, there are women that have different ideological and political positioning, and this is absolutely normal. It's like that everywhere in the world. And there are moments where strategic alliances happen, and this is also productive. But strategic alliances can, for instance, if there were coalitions, even in the immediate aftermath of the 2011 revolutions, because the state tried to exclude women from institutional politics, but this gave them even more energy to join forces and to say no. And they public statements claiming that they had been part of the revolution and they wanted to be in the constitutional committees, they wanted to be in the parliament, they wanted to be in institutional politics. There have also been moments where young women decided not to trust institutional politics and creating their own groups and task force.
امتى حصل ده؟ امتى حصل ده؟
Well, it's the first strong attack documented against women during, in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, or if we want to say, if you think of revolution as a long process, we can say during the revolution, was the demonstration of the 8th of March 2011 that was attacked by thugs. And then on the 9th of March, women were arrested and tortured in the Egyptian Museum. And since then, there has been an escalation of attacks, targeted attacks against women that culminated, 2012, according to the reports that I have read, because associations such as Al-Nadim, but also Nazra for Feminist Studies, have documented attacks against women. 2012 was a very critical year that became even more serious throughout 2013 until demonstrations were forbidden. But in these two years, there were task forces to defend women against sexual assaults and rapes during demonstrations. And actually, they have also been documented in forms of memoirs by women who had been part of it.
يعني هو ده على مستوى الاتاك اللي حصل على النساء عموما المشاركات في الثورة. لكن بالعودة لنقطة الانقسام اللي حصلت، يعني محاولة حضرتك سردت في كتابك محاولة الفترة بتاعت مبارك انها تأسس اللي بتسميه الانستيتيوشنال فيمينيزم من خلال مثلا ضم النساء لمجلس القومي لحقوق الانسان، كوتا في البرلمان مثلا بشكل او باخر، او تعيين وزيرة مثلا. لأي مدى النمط ده من النسوية المؤسسية بتعبيرك يعني ساهم في إفقاد جزء من الحركة النسوية حيويتها وإسهامها الحقيقي في إنها تدافع عن حقوق الإنسان؟
Yes, in my book I focused more on grassroots activities and non-institutional feminism, because I found that this is the space where a revolutionary philosophy developed. In the age of Mubarak, and this has been studied also by many Egyptian feminist scholars, the state tried to co-opt feminist activism and to appropriate their initiatives, especially, of course, through the National Council for Women, but also other activities. But the limitations of this action was that the action that was happening in the context of the state is that they could work on a number of topics as long as the state was not criticized or questioned. So these clearly, these programs benefited a lot of women, especially, you know, women in rural areas. There was this project about providing women with identity cards. You know, in Egypt, there were women in rural areas that don't even have an identity card. And these state projects certainly benefited these women, were important. But it's developing a critical revolutionary philosophy and thought. It's something else that happened in the social movements and happened in the intellectual spaces, that happened in the independent spaces.
الريفوليوشنري فيلوسفي اللي حضرتك بتتكلمي عليها اتكونت فين بقى في مصر؟ يعني ايه النقط، ايه السبوتس اللي اتكونت فيها اكتر؟
في كتير.
هل منظمات مجتمع مدني؟ هل حركات عماليه؟ ايه من خلال بحثك العام ايه اكتر المناطق اللي كانت يعني ساهمت في توليد التصورات الثوريه دي؟
Yeah, there were a lot of movements. First, there were, you know, underground reading groups, and of course, the workers' movement has been an important engine, and women were a big part of it. You know, still poorly documented. You know, I could find some interviews to women in the workers' movement, photographies made by Egyptian artists, you know, during the sit-in, during the occupation and the strikes, where, you know, the action of women is very well documented. Certainly, Mahal al-Kubra was a crucial space. There was, of course, the 7th of April movement, where women were an important component of the movement. There were Wirul Khaled Said, but even before Kifaya and the movement of the revolutionary socialists, you know, all and you know, even most importantly, and this is what I'm focusing mostly in my book, women in the human rights organizations. This was a space where a different culture about the intersection between politics and private life and even sexuality was described and was imagined. And all these movements, you know, created an atmosphere that made the revolution possible to be imagined, you know, and these were very dynamic years. But, you know, these were also years, you know, the 90s and the early 2000s, where the publishing sphere saw a lot of protagonism of women intellectuals. For instance, you know, these days we read writers like Maitel Missani, Iman Mersal, or you know, now these are the first two names that come to my mind. These are all writers of the so-called generation of Tessaniyet, you know, the generation of the 90s. And are writers that have brought, you know, the narratives about the intimate spheres, you know, and very personal and intimate stories to, you know, to the attention of mainstream literature. And even if not all of these writers define themselves explicitly as feminists and don't think of feminism directly as a paradigm to imagine themselves, like Nawal al-Saadawi would have done, I argue that in their writings there is a lot of feminism.
طب بالظبط، يعني كنت عايز اسالك بقى في السياق ده، ايه هي اهم الكونتريبيوشنز، يعني الاسهامات اللي قدموها الكاتبات النسويات للتصورات السياسية في مصر في الفترة اللي حضرتك تسرديها، يعني ما بين الثمانينات والتسعينات وصولا للثورة؟
The contribution of women's writers to the
الأفكار يعني اللي أضافوها
revolution.
كنسويات لتصورات عن حقوق الإنسان، عن الديمقراطية، اللي ما كانش ممكن تبقى موجودة لو هم مش موجودين.
أيوة. Well, it's huge. The contribution of women's writers, it's huge also as internal critique. You know, if you the young women, you know, of 2011 were reading, you know, sometimes I would ask them, what is the book that you have in your pocket today, you know, in your backpack? And there was a moment where, they were all reading Latif Al-Zayat, The Open Door, which is a novel that was published first in 1960, and it's the first novel that is written by a woman that is considered canonical in Egyptian literature. And it was a very popular novel, and of course it's a very political novel.
Film also.
Popular film as well, exactly. But they literally had it in their backpack when we were meeting in a cafe. Or Arwa Saleh, became very popular, and Arwa Saleh provided a very internal critique to the communist movement.
تمام. يعني في السياق ده برضو اللي فهمته من كتاب حضرتك انه انت بتعتبري انه الحركه النسويه لو خدناها بمعناها الواسع هي يعني اللي فهمته انك بتقولي انها مش مجرد شريك في الثوره المصريه لكنها محرك اساسي ليه. ايه اللي تقصديه تحديدا بالفكره دي؟
Yes, I argue that documented that women were leaders, they were not just partners in the revolution. In their statements, they claimed to be partners in the revolution. I claim, no, you were not just partners, you were absolute leader, even if this idea of leadership is contested by them. They told me in their interviews, I'm not an icon, I'm not a leader, I'm one among many. So they have a specific idea of horizontal leadership. But clearly, the famous call that came on the eve of a few days before the revolution and went viral on internet, read by Asba Mahfouz came from a woman. One could, they could have chosen anyone else. They decided that it would have been a woman, and this kind of woman. Why? One should try to understand also the symbolic message that was behind this. And of course, some of the main media that were launched in the aftermath of the revolution, including Almanassa, have women's leadership, and which I argue are feminist leadership. Women have been from the interviews I have collected, I have found women being at the forefront of all the projects that came out of the revolution. Then, did they achieve a leadership position in formal politics? Not necessarily, but certainly we have figures who played high-profile roles in the development of Egypt, and you have, the women who participated in the Constitutional Committee and then documented it. And you have the women who led political parties, especially in the context of the Al Dastur party. First Hala Shukrallah, then Camila Ismail, and these are all women that come from long-term training in politics. They have been there doing grassroots activism since they were university students, and they never left the political arena. And they. So it's in this way, I think that it's, we don't really understand Egypt unless we read it also through the lenses of women's political activism and women in the trade unions. I'm sorry, I forgot to, and that's absolutely important. There is this link between the human rights movement and the workers' movement, where women are a very important
يعني يمكن للسبب ده حضرتك بتعتقدي انه الحركه النسويه ما اتهزمتش في الثوره زي ما ناس كتير ممكن تكون متصوره.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it's women are literally at the core of the revolutionary movement, and even most importantly, if in current times where clearly a revolutionary idea cannot be put forward, but continuing, the work of transmission of feminist knowledge, continuing this work of care and giving to the word care a political meaning has an impact.
انا حابب اتوقف قدام النقطه دي لانها نقطه مهمه قوي. يعني ايه معنى ان احنا ندي بقى الكير بوليتكس او الكير سوشيال لايف يعني او بوليتيكال مينينج بالظبط يعني.
Yeah, it's absolutely important, and this also has a global importance. No? We are living extremely dreadful times. Yeah, and there's not even need to mention what are the issues that are making the world a dark place to be at the moment. So, what is the strategy to survive in dark times? To find, to overcome this sense of being powerless, when international law is not respected, when human rights are not respected, when the rule of law doesn't have a meaning, you risk to feel extremely powerless. So the strategy that I see activating by the women I am close to is to stop and take care of the immediate people around them and about but also about memories, collective memories, and about the people we work with. So if you are a teacher, you take very good care of your students and you train them to imagine a different future, taking care of the planet, of the environment. And we have seen women's activism during in environmental movements. It's a strategy and it's a practice that in the medium long term can contribute to create to promote a change that in this book I narrate a genealogy that goes from the students' movement of the 70s until 2011. And I said, okay, Marxism has been an important ideology that has shaped a certain way of thinking the world, of thinking revolution, and of imagining a better society.
Okay.
Clearly, today we need a change to come from a different space. And we don't know what this space is going to be. But what we can do is to take care of our and future generations and the space we live in to prepare this change. And this is the lesson that we learn from the previous generations that went throughout phases of inability to act directly or to create social movements.
خليني اسالك في المعنى ده، يمكن ده مش يعني جزء من النقط اللي كنا اتناقشنا فيها قبل كده، بس تعليق حضرتك يمكن بيفكرني بالحلقه بتاعت دكتوره ليلى سويف، وازاي انها في الوقت الحالي بتحاول انها يعني كل افكارها عن نضالها ليها علاقه بالحفاظ على سواء حق ابنها او حق حافدها. هل تعتقدي انه اضرابها عن الطعام هو امتداد للتصورات عن رعايه او تمهيد الحياه للاجيال اللي جايه؟
Dr. Leila Soueif is clearly she's been an inspiring figure for not from now but for decades, and not only for me but for a number of scholars in Egypt and abroad. Dr. Leila Soueif has been awarded human rights awards from multiple international associations, including the Association for Middle East Studies of North America, and she's someone who clearly embodies what we mean with politics of care today. She's someone that when people were asking her what can be done, what can we do for Allah, she would respond, just talk about him, and don't forget that there are many young people in the same situation as Allah, and they are not as known as he is. So a mother who invites other people to think of the others, to think more broadly, it's clearly the embodiment of how the personal is political, and how taking care of the others is the real meaning of life. Clearly, her extreme action, we don't know where it will take in practice. We all hope that it will have a positive outcome, and this would be the best solution for everyone, including the government, if you want, coming up with an action of care for its citizens would certainly have a positive effect also for them. But whatever will be the outcome, she's someone that is launching a very important message of justice, of care, of how politics is part of our everyday life, and even in the darkest time, we shouldn't give up to thinking collectively and to think that we are a community. What is incredible about Professor Soueif is that she mobilized an international community around them. There have been people on hunger strike around the world taking turns. There have been people launching appeals everywhere in Egypt and outside. So this community is something very, very special that we should be grateful to her for having created. It's a gift that she's given to everyone, and that's why she would really deserve to succeed in her demand, which is also a very simple and legitimate demand.
عظيم. بننتقل بقى لآخر النقطة، يعني يمكن مرتبطة شوية بالواقع المعاصر، مش بالقراية التاريخية، يعني اللي ليها علاقة بالعمل، بمسألة العمل تحديدا، وتأثيرها على حقوق المرأة، أو التصورات أو تأثيرها على الحركة النسوية. ويمكن حضرتك تعرضتي في سردك لمسألة مثلا عمال المحلة، واتكلمتي مع نشطات عاملات كتير، والنهارده يمكن في كتابات كتير قوي عن ازاي انه بيئة العمل بتتدهور لأسباب ليها علاقة بزيادة اللا رسمية، الانفورمال وورك، وانه في يمكن رفض من القطاع الخاص في حالات كتير ان هو يعين النساء، لانه مش عايز حقوق اضافية زي الحق مثلا في فترة الرضاعة، والحق في الاجازات وخلافه. يعني من خلال نظرتك لمقابلاتك بالذات للنشطات العاملات في مصر، لأي مدى شايفة بيئة العمل في صدام مع تطلعات الحركة النسوية؟
In terms of work, well, anecdotally, I can tell you that I don't think I know a single woman in Egypt who doesn't work. Yeah, I have no memory of that. And this is true also in history. Women have always been working. The point is women's work acknowledged? Statistics don't help us very much in understand women's work, because and this has been underlined by Egyptian women's political economists a lot. They have questioned, even in the 90s, in the early 2000s, the statistics provided by the government about women's employment. Because the statistics do not reflect the reality of women's work, that it's sometimes informal, or sometimes they don't, it simply don't recorded, or for instance, underemployment is not captured by the statistics. So there are women that have high degrees and they are not employed at their level. And even this is an issue that women have been underlined since the beginning of feminists. There is these pioneers in women's education, Nabawiya Musa, that famously, she published a memoir, and she was active in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and she writes an essay titled Women and Work, in a collection of writings titled Women and Work. So the issue of work has been at the core of feminist activism since the 20s. When, in the 20s, feminism was obviously a smaller movement, in Egypt, like everywhere, yeah? It was not the mass, the larger movement that develops in the 70s, the 80s, and today even more. No, in the 20s was a contained movement, but even in this contained movement, work was a crucial issue at many levels. And it was a political issue. The way women journalists write about work in that period, it's very political. And it continues later, in the 40s, the 50s, etc. So it's to go back to your first question, what a feminist historiography adds to our knowledge. It is important to look also at work, the history of work from a feminist perspective. Hanan Ahmad did it in her book. And it's a very important book. Industrial Sexuality, Gender, Urbanization and Social Transformation in Egypt. And her research is in Mahalla, specifically. It's an historical research. Well, it shows that, women were workers, were entrepreneurs, were, and also something that historians have underlined but should be studied more is the impact of colonial policies on women's work. How colonial industrialization had an impact on the quality of women's work and somehow disempowered women. Now, these colonial practices continue in the post-colonial state, where working forces are more and more exploited, and women are the most exploited.
طب حضرتك شفت بقى يعني من مقابلاتك في الفيلد وورك نفسها ازاي الستات كانوا بيقاوموا الاكسكلوجن الاستبعاد ده؟
In many ways. Well, first of all, there are feminist organizations that have documented gender discriminations at work and advocated for women. And I was discussing this specifically with Hala Shukrallah, and the research who also has a background of studies in political economy, and all her work has always been with women's workers. And so through her research and through advocacy, but also projects of the New Women's Foundation, they have been at the forefront of actions to support women in work. And later on, in other grassroots movements have been advocating, working with women. But the most interesting thing, and especially this in the years of the strikes in Mahalla, is how women workers took the lead in the protests and create, and developed, and were a crucial part in the development of the workers' movement. And this is natural because, they were, in many cases, they were the breadwinners, but they were less paid, because some of them were telling me we couldn't take the night shifts that are the best paid, and therefore we ended up having lower salaries. So they were contesting these practices, etc. So it has been a movement that has grown in different phases and different ways, and certainly will continues to have an impact that I have not documented because my research has stopped at a certain level. But I am sure that if sociologists are working on workers' conditions and workers' demands today, they would have to talk to a lot of women to make their research productive.
اعتقد انه يعني القصص الملهمة لعاملات المحلة ممكن تكون افضل ختام لحديثنا عن الدور الريادي يعني للحركة النسوية في الحراك الاجتماعي لمصر. شكرا جزيلا دكتورة لوشيا، واتمنى ان نلتقي في حوار جديد مع المنصة.
شكرا لك.